Well, howdy, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to History Class. We're down to just a couple of weeks. Coming down, and down the stretch they come. As they would have said at the Kentucky Derby if they were able to have it on Saturday, which makes me sad. But anyway, so today we are going to look a little bit at what has happened in Europe over the period of the Cold War and maybe a little bit about the years after. Obviously, we've talked a lot about how things are going as it relates to Russia and the so-called Eastern Bloc, the Eastern European nations. We're going to take a little bit, back half of the video today, we're going to take a little more of a look at the movements for independence in those different Eastern European nations that helped push the Soviet Union over the cliff. But also, we're going to start by taking a little brief walk through what happened in Western Europe. So, when we last left the European story, it was all the way back in 1945, really, as far as Western Europe's concerned. So we'll go on back there in time. So right at the end of World War II, you have a situation where there's been a lot of devastation to the Western European powers. The German war has really taken a toll on them. There's lots of people dead, lots of property damage, lots of loss of population. And this created, of course, the potential for instability in some of these places. And as we mentioned probably a couple weeks ago now, might have been last week. It was a couple weeks ago for American history, maybe. But the American president, Harry Truman, signed off on something known as the Marshall Plan, which is an idea of the American Secretary of State, General George C. Marshall. And the Marshall Plan called for basically the Americans spending extraordinary amounts of money to help rebuild Western Europe. And the reason that the Americans did that was because we didn't want a temptation toward dictatorship to emerge in Western Europe, as had happened in the period between World War I and World War II, where the economic devastation of World War I helped facilitate the rise of fascism in Italy and Nazism in Germany. So we spent a lot of money to try to rebuild Western Europe, and a couple things come of that. One is pretty much all the Western European nations joined NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was the organization that was established as kind of a mutual defense pact that we basically said, Russia, if you attack one of us, you attack all of us. And the United States and Canada joined in that, as well as most of the North American countries. Though we also had a similar one called SEATO in Southeast Asia. The Russians responded with something called the Warsaw Pact, and the Warsaw Pact was a similar mutual defense pact among the communist nations of Eastern Europe: Russia, East Germany, Slovakia, Poland, Romania, etc. Of course, the thing about the Warsaw Pact is nobody in the Warsaw Pact was really acting independently of the Soviet Union anyway. The USSR really was the puppet master behind most of those Warsaw Pact countries. So you have Europe kind of divided into two camps. And on the Western Front, obviously probably the most important nation in Europe remains Great Britain. But Great Britain after World War II is a very different country than Great Britain before. She's still one of the strongest X amount of economies in the world. But Britain is after World War II is no longer able to throw its weight around on the world stage quite the way they once did. In World War I, the British kind of went into that war slightly ahead of us in terms of power in the world. Maybe even probably a little ahead still. No, not even until after World War I. Going into World War II, maybe we were a little bit more looking eye to eye. After World War II, Britain is going to definitely have to take the sidekick role in the British-American alliance. And Britain and America do become very close allies throughout the Cold War. Probably Great Britain was the number one country that we leaned on for assistance in a number of different things as it relates to foreign policy, intelligence, all the kind of stuff, and has been one of our better allies. So, but one thing about Britain, as well as the French as well, they're both going to have to surrender their overseas empire because they just do not have the power anymore to enforce it, to manage it, to control it. They don't have the economy, they don't have the troops. And so slowly but surely they start granting independence to the colonies of Asia and Africa, and we're going to do lessons about the emergence of those new countries. Excuse me. But in the period between 45 and 65, I mean, you get, 20, 30 new countries coming to the world. As a result of European colonial powers, kind of surrendering and granting them independence. One thing that happens in a lot of these European countries after World War II is that because the Marshall Plan and NATO and some of these other things, because the Americans were contributing so much to the defense of Western Europe, the Western European nations were able to kind of take advantage of that to reroute a lot of what would have been military spending for them. Not that they didn't keep up their militaries, but they rerouted a lot of what would have been military spending toward domestic spending. And most of the Western European nations settled into a kind of democracy socialism hybrid. So they had, they were still what you would generally consider free countries. They have free elections, representative government, sort of free speech, although not as strong as in America. You have a lot more leeway with free speech. Then it's a little more absolute than in Europe. But in general, you have a right to debate. So in general, it's still what you would consider a free country, but your economic freedom is somewhat curtailed. So, what they would do is a lot of them would set up, again, most are still democracies, but they would set up extraordinarily expansive welfare states based on extraordinary rates of taxation. So there are countries in Europe where the top tax rate is pushing 70% at times for income above a certain level. You've got, and in exchange for that, they've got really high minimum wage, a lot of industries nationalized. Some countries have like 35-hour work weeks instead of 40. Some of them have weeks of mandated vacation time that a company can't write. They're really, they rob themselves of a lot of economic productivity, but evidently the people there are, for the most part, have taken the trade-off. A lot of what they have suggested wouldn't fly very well with Americans. But while most of Europe has had what they call a mixed economy, meaning a mixture of free markets and government management or command economies associated with socialism, the command to market ratio has changed over the years, because in the immediate years after World War II, most of these countries went through a very socialistic phase. What happens is by the 1970s, all those economies are stagnated because, as Margaret Thatcher, the former British Prime Minister, famously said, the problem with socialism, you eventually run out of other people's money. Come the late 70s, these countries were really starting to stagnate economically, and were no longer able to remain vibrant and growing the way they had been. And so there begins to be a push in the 80s and 90s towards opening up more free market aspects to the economy. This is a movement that is referred to as neoliberalism, because liberal over there actually kind of means the opposite of what it means in the United States. Go figure, it's a long story about that. At the end of, before the World War II is quite finished, Winston Churchill actually gets voted out in Britain and replaced by a fellow by the name of Clement Attlee. Attlee moves Britain in this socialist direction. They completely nationalize the healthcare industry. There's it's literally impossible to go start a private doctor's office or hospital. It's all done through the government over there by law. That was not the only industry that they nationalized. So they actually nationalized or socialized several different industries where the government took complete control of them for a period of time. But there, come the 70s, there gets to be this kind of pervasive stagnation in the British economy throughout the 70s, this kind of leads to the election of Margaret Thatcher as Prime Minister. Just about simultaneous to the election of Ronald Reagan as the American president. And the two of them had quite a bit in common in terms of their beliefs. And so both of them pushed their respective countries in the direction of more economic freedom and less government control. France, after World War II, wound up under the leadership of Charles de Gaulle, who had, if you remember, he had been the general in charge of the Free French resistance forces in World War II. So after France collapsed before Dunkirk, X amount of Frenchmen escaped to England and, kind of plot how to remain in the fight against the Nazis. And de Gaulle was in charge of that Free French government in exile that was located in London. At the end of the war, he winds up being elected Premier of France. France has to, because the previous French government had been conquered by the Nazis who installed the Vichy French, and then the Vichy's got taken down by the Allies, France has to write another constitution. But shockingly, this one has actually lasted a long time. They've kind of had the same system of government for the most part since World War II. So France is finally stabilized after 150 years of just absolute chaos between 1792 and 1945. And de Gaulle, after a little while, the American presidents kind of didn't like de Gaulle after a little while because he was a little bit of a lone wolf. He had this idea of trying to position France as a little bit of a third force kind of between the Americans and the Soviets, and we didn't like all of that. But for the most part, the French stuck by our side, although the French kind of famously developed an anti-American streak somewhere over this time period. And if you go to France, according to most people I've talked to, a lot of them will be quite rude to you if they find out you're American, which shouldn't take long. And so, France kind of goes through a little bit of a similar story as Britain. They never move as deep into free market reforms as the Brits did. Granted, I mean, if you're a diehard American conservative, any European country with like one or two exceptions is going to drive you insane in terms of if you had to immigrate there, finding a candidate you'd like to vote for. Because I mean, even the most conservative politicians in Western Europe are what we would consider pretty liberal over here. Meanwhile, so what happens to Germany? And Germany, in this case, winds up, as we've talked about, being divided between East Germany and West Germany. So we've mentioned, East Germany was under communist control. We talked about the Berlin airlift, the Berlin Wall, all those sorts of things. But West Germany actually takes people by surprise. First off, it's kind of a strange thing how quickly West Germany becomes a staunch ally of the countries that they had just gone to war with. And it's a little awkward almost when you think about it, because like 1945, these guys are like doing the Holocaust, like not just fighting a war, like they did the Holocaust. And then, 1948, the West Germans are considered, a key American ally. And so it's a little awkward at first. You almost think, is this even all right? But at the same time, if you look at, the failure of kind of this more vengeful tack that the Brits and French took towards the Germans after World War I, we said we don't want to do that again. So we worked really hard to get West Germany on our side. Seeing the terrible alternative right there in East Germany probably helped us with that. You didn't exactly have much of a communist movement in West Germany because, most of the people in East Germany are trying to get out. The first major leader of West Germany is a fellow by the name of Konrad Adenauer. and he's considered a pretty capable leader. And over a large part of Adenauer's tenure, West Germany actually experiences what they call the miracle, or which is maybe short for the West German economic miracle, which is, if you look at how devastated Germany should have been from the war, West Germany actually grew leaps and bounds really quick in a way that stunned people all across the world. And so the nation of West Germany really rebounds very fast. In hindsight, we're kind of so used to Germany being just another one of the various European countries now that it's hard to think back to 1950 and think how strange it is that the Germans would suddenly be in a defense pact with the Americans and the British. And in fact, we'll see, we're going to talk about, German unification in just a moment. Even in 1989, when Germany is reunified, there's a few people who are like, yeah, is this a good idea? Because you remember the last time that they were together, bad things happened to the world. But West Germany develops kind of a pretty thriving democracy. Meanwhile, East Germany does not. East Germany, under communist control, widespread poverty, and becomes a very unpleasant place to live. So many people try to flee it that they have to literally build a wall to trap people in the city of East Berlin. So that's kind of setting up, that's Eastern and Western and Central Europe going into kind of the winds of change beginning to blow in the late 80s. And in Central and Eastern Europe, really change begins in the nation of Poland. And in particular, a man emerges as a major leader in Poland by the name of Lech Walesa, and he was the leader of an anti-communist labor union known as Solidarity. Now, it's funny to think of a anti-communist labor union because in America, unions have a real reputation of having, at least in the past, of having been, very hard left and infiltrated by communists and so on. So it's weird to think of a labor union being a major bulwark against communism, but in this case, it was. So Solidarity was this movement to kind of represent the workers of Poland over against the Communist Party. And they led a number of protests, including at one point a strike, where most of where all the members of that union went on strike in the various nationalized industries of Poland, which kind of forced the regime to have to make some concessions. Walesa was being encouraged in his agitation for reform by the American President Ronald Reagan and also by the Pope, who was a man named John Paul II, who was actually Polish born. He's one of the first people in a long, long time to become Pope who was not either Italian or French. So, it was very rare to have really, it had become rare to have anyone outside of Italy. I mentioned the French just because of the whole Avignon era way back in the late medieval days. But, but anyway, John Paul II becomes Pope, and he kind of helps lead some of this movement. And in fact, there's actually a great documentary called Liberating a Continent. It used to be on Netflix. I don't know if it still is or not, where it actually talks about the role that the church played in freeing Poland. It was actually more than you would have thought. But ultimately, the strike begins to have enough of an impact on the Polish communist government that finally, in right around 1989, they open up elections and actually allow people to vote. And so no election had been held in Poland since, no free election had been held in Poland since World War II. They had the fake vote for the communist election in, when, where the Russian troops, rigged the vote or whatever. But they hadn't had a real vote since before Hitler and Stalin simultaneously invaded in 1939. So, and Walesa whose name is spelt really weird, by the way. It's spelt Walesa, which I don't know where they get the N sound. I understand that the W makes a V sound in that country, but I don't understand where you get an N sound for Valenza. Similar to, the Polish-American basketball coach Mike Krzyzewski of Duke. His name is spelled like KRCZ something. Like, how do you get to Krzyzewski from KRZ? I don't understand. But anyway, I don't speak Polish, unfortunately. Anyway, so Valenza actually gets named to be the first president and leads an independent Poland. Valenza's term kind of ends a little rocky. They had some economic problems. A lot of these countries, when they left communism, tried to this idea of shock therapy, which is to just dive headlong into the kind of market economy that we have here, and sometimes it led to economic growth that was happening like so fast that it caused like extreme inflation, and then actually like became counterproductive. And I think some of that happened in Poland, but Poland's kind of settled into being a fairly well off country, doing okay. I mean, they've got some issues with corruption and some stuff like that, but a decent enough country, and they're in control of their own destiny now, unlike under the communist days. From there, you also had a movement swept from Poland into Hungary, where Hungary was, another one of these Eastern European countries that had been a Soviet puppet for a long time. In 1956, the Hungarians had tried to assert more self-determination against the Russians, and the Soviet Union responded by sending tanks into the capital of Budapest and basically enforcing Soviet control of Hungary. Well, late 80s, there's this stronger and stronger anti-communist movement, and the Hungarian Communist Party winds up actually, the reform current was so strong that the Communist Party in Hungary literally voted itself out of existence. And Hungary became a democracy, not necessarily one of the strongest ones in the world. Unfortunately, in the last couple of years, we've had a guy emerge as a leader in Hungary named Viktor Orban, who's kind of shown some dictatorial tendencies. So we'll see if Hungary remains a democracy. But, freedom came to Hungary in 1989. So you've got Poland and Hungary breaking away from Soviet control, and East Germany is going to be next. The East Germans, many of them had tried to flee East Germany. Many people had tried to escape over the Berlin Wall. When Hungary starts to open things up, they started allowing East Germans who had gone to Hungary to travel for vacations or whatever. They started to allow them to escape from Hungary into the country of Austria, from which they could escape into West Germany. And so a lot of East Germans started going to Hungary to vacation and then defecting to West Germany. Well, the East Germans started to figure this out, and of course they wanted people to stay there so that they could use their labor to fuel the state and so on. So what they started to do was they completely closed their borders to where they made it to where no East German can leave the country. And, it's kind of strange for a country to be forcing people to stay. It's one thing if it's in the middle of an emergency, but in like an ordinary period of time. And, they close the borders completely. So this leads to a wave of protest in East Germany against this. This is right around the same time frame that the American President Reagan, who's, in my opinion, the greatest of recent decades or century or so. Reagan makes the famous speech at West Berlin, standing at the Brandenburg Gate, which is one of the gates opening the Berlin Wall. He's on the West German side, but he says it such that people in the East could hear it. He makes this speech because Gorbachev was in the middle of this whole glasnost and perestroika thing where they're trying to allow more dissent and allow a little bit more freedom in some markets. And he says, Mr. Gorbachev, if you're serious about making this change, here's an easy way that you can show us, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And I talked in another video about just how important that moment was, and hopefully a couple of you took the time to watch that little clip that I sent you of that news report from the time. And of course, when he said it, I mean, it was pandemonium over there in West Germany. I mean, everyone, the crowd went nuts. And so, as the Soviet Union begins to collapse, the prospect opens up for East Germany to actually reunify with West Germany. People start protesting against the Berlin Wall. And in fact, Gorbachev never does tear down the wall, and neither does the East German president at the time, whose name was, let me double check, Honecker, that's right. I knew Helmut Kohl was the West German guy, but it's not the government that tears down the wall. The people do it. People started coming with axes and just whatever they can find to chip away at the Berlin Wall. The government had to make the decision not to just mow them all down with guns, though. So they kind of conceded, let people start to chip away at it. Then you started to have free travel across the two parts of Berlin, which is it's crazy. Put yourself in the shoes of a Berliner. If you were on the east side and you had a brother, a cousin, a friend who was on the west side, all of a sudden they literally put you into two different countries, even though you're from the same town. You're considered to be part of two different countries. You can't travel between each other. And then they put up a wall between. So there are people who literally had relatives that were 15 miles away that they haven't seen in decades because of this Berlin Wall stuff. And so, I mean, there was a celebration in the streets and like you've never seen with that either. The Berlin Wall finally crashes. And that, again, was, I believe, the big year of 1980s. Well, 1987 is when it... No, it is 89. It is 89. So, and so then you begin to have this movement for reunification. Some of the European countries were a little concerned about unification because everyone was like, remember the last time they were together, they kind of tried to conquer the world and kill all the Jews. It's not a good thing. The leader of West Germany was a guy by the name of Helmut Kohl, and he wound up moving in the direction of favoring reunification, and he was able to kind of convince the rest of the world that Germany had kind of learned its lesson, that they didn't have anything to fear from Germany being reunified, and that they would not once again become a threat to people's security. And so he is able to win over the governments of the other major democracies to supporting reunification. Reunification was a bit of a sacrifice for people in the West because the East German economy was so bad and the West German economy was so much better that for that country to absorb this much poverty was going to be a bad deal because all of a sudden you've got to deal with people that haven't been having as good educations. You got to deal with people that have been West Germany has built this really elaborate welfare state. It's connected to a certain level of lifestyle fueling the government with their taxes, and then now you've got a whole nation of people that probably qualify for that West German welfare state coming into your country. So there were going to be some economic and cultural sacrifices that the West Germans had to make to accomplish that unity, but it winds up being a celebrated moment in German history, and Germany has kind of emerged as probably the most powerful country on continental Europe. We'll talk about the one thing when we talk about Western Europe, the one thing that was important that I didn't talk about was the European Union. We're going to talk about that in a later lecture, but that was one of the most I lost my train of thought. I'm recording this pretty late at night. I'm sorry. Yeah, because I'm too much of a procrastinator. But so the issue with the European Union, ultimately you wind up with a situation where Germany has really become probably the most influential country in determining kind of EU politics and EU positions. So you've got freedom comes to East Germany, to Poland, to Hungary. Then it begins to sweep to some other places. One was the nation of Czechoslovakia, which had been a communist nation. There is a dissident by the name of Václav Havel, who is one of the really famous anti-communist writers. I think he had actually been a playwright before he got so active in politics. Once again, we don't need to go into all the details, but once again, you have another country where the communist government collapses. Czechoslovakia winds up abandoning communism. They hold free elections. Havel actually becomes the first president. Once Czechoslovakia gains their functional independence from the Soviet Union and leaves communism, the Czechs and Slovaks kind of started to push for their two because Czechoslovakia is the land of the Czechs and the Slovaks, so these two different peoples. Both of those groups started to have independent sentiment. Ultimately, the decision is made to split it into two countries, the Czech Republic and Slovakia. Havel didn't like this at all. He thought they should remain unified. He actually resigned the presidency rather than go along with that plan. But nonetheless, the two countries were split, although they did it without bloodshed. Romania is the last of the major Eastern European countries to shed their communist dictatorship. They had a pretty terrible person by the name of Nicolae Ceausescu, who was in charge, and he was another one of these guys who was brutal and killed many people. And in particular, he massacred some Romanian protesters during this time period in a town square, and that was kind of his undoing. It led to the country really turning on him in a strong way. He winds up being overthrown and killed in the process. And so Romania also becomes yet another young democracy. The country of all these that has the most struggle in the post-Soviet era is Yugoslavia. And so Yugoslavia was a country that was kind of drawn out of parts of the old Ottoman Empire. It was kind of drawn on the map at the end of World War I. And it makes up much of the... I'm trying to swat a fly there, I'm sorry. Makes up much of the Balkan Peninsula. There in Europe, it kind of sits off the Mediterranean. And the thing about Yugoslavia, it was a really thrown together country that had a lot of different ethnicities. And not only a lot of ethnicities, but also a lot of different languages, and also some religious differences. You had some populations that were Muslim, there were some that were Eastern Orthodox Christians, some that were Roman Catholic Christians. So, ultimately, what Yugoslavia does, and Yugoslavia actually was the one that was of all the Eastern European countries, they were the one that was most independent of the Soviet Union. The Yugoslav leadership kind of liked to buck the USSR. In particular, there was a leader by the name of Joseph Tito, and he was the dictator of Yugoslavia from 1945 all the way until 1980. And he actually wound up kind of being a wild card in the Cold War. Sometimes the Soviets would get really frustrated with him. So Tito kind of held Yugoslavia together with his iron fist, and then when he dies, there starts to be some controversy amongst the different parts. So ultimately, Yugoslavia was a confederation of 6 different regions, which were Serbia, which, if you remember, was also involved in World War I, Serbia, Macedonia, which was the homeland of Alexander the Great. If you remember, Yugoslavia is just north of Greece and borders Greece. You had Montenegro, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Croatia, and Slovenia. And then also, since then, so ultimately, Yugoslavia is going to break into these 6 countries ultimately, and then a 7th country from old Yugoslavia, because the region of Kosovo is going to break away as well. So, one of the leaders of the Serbians was a very, very nasty man by the name of Slobodan Milosevic. And Milosevic kind of asserted Serbian leadership over Yugoslavia. A lot of Serbs opposed him, but in right around 1990, 91, two of the many republics within Yugoslavia, Slovenia and Croatia, declare independence. So the Yugoslav army, which is being controlled by the Serbians, invades, and then in early 1992, Bosnia-Herzegovina joins in declaring independence. And so, and then in April, Serbia and Montenegro are forming the basis of a new Yugoslavia. So the population of Bosnia was pretty mixed. It was 44% Muslim, 31% Croat, 31% Serb, and 17% Croat. And so all the different groups that were running around were, there were Serbs, Croats, Muslims, Slovenes, Macedonians, Albanians, Hungarians, and Montenegrins. So there were like 8 major groups within this Yugoslav region. The Muslims and Croats in Bosnia wanted independence, but a lot of the Serbs wanted Bosnia to stay in Yugoslavia because they were sympathetic to Milosevic because he was Serbian. And so the Bosnian Serbs kind of started a civil war inside of Bosnia, and it turns into a humanitarian disaster. They have to start sending UN peacekeeping troops, and in fact, American troops went over to Bosnia in 1992 to kind of help keep the peace. But what begins to happen is that that ultimately is the thing that brings all this foreign military involvement, is that the Serbians start practicing genocide. They called it ethnic cleansing, was the policy that they came up with, or the name they attached to it. Basically, it was genocide against the Bosnian Muslims. They either forced them to leave the country, or in many cases killed them. And the idea was to get all the Muslims out of Bosnia. So by 1995, the Serbian military controlled 70% of it. Then there was a peace treaty agreed to in 1995, and by 96, Bosnia started to have a 3-person presidency, one president from each of the 3 groups. And by the turn of the century, Bosnia-Herzegovina was a little bit more peaceful. However, there was yet another flare-up of violence in Yugoslavia in the 1990s. This is when Bill Clinton was president, kind of right around 1998. I remember this going down. I would have been 9 or 10, but I remember it being in the news when my parents were watching and stuff. Actually, I was weird and kind of watched the news too. When I was a kid, I was weird. But ultimately, 1998, there was a province inside of Serbia that was known as Kosovo. And Kosovo was made up predominantly of ethnic Albanians. And there was an independence movement got started in Kosovo, started to turn violent. Serbian military started to invade, and the Serbians started to do all sorts of terrible humanitarian things, just genocide and killing a lot of civilians. And so NATO troops, including American troops, launched a bombing campaign against the Serbians in defense of the Kosovo independence movement. Finally, the Yugoslav leaders finally get their troops out of Kosovo, and Kosovo actually becomes an independent nation around the 2008, 9, 10, somewhere in that range. And I think Kosovo is either the newest or second newest country in the world. I can't remember if they got started before or after South Sudan. But ultimately, Milosevic, who's kind of the big bad guy of the Yugoslav Civil War, is brought to justice. He actually faces trial at something known as the International Criminal Court at The Hague in the Netherlands, which was a tribunal for dealing with war crimes that was established connected to the United Nations. So Milosevic is brought to justice, but not before he had killed quite a few people in the lands that had once been Yugoslavia. So that kind of brings us up to date on Europe, with the exception of, we'll talk about the European Union and some of that in the context of a lesson next week on the globalization of the economy. We're going to spend most of the rest of this week looking at the Middle East and how events in the Middle East wound up bringing us into wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. We'll look at the foundation of Israel as a nation and a lot of these different other things. So y'all have yourselves a good day, and I hope to see you soon.